Yet, as the title of this talk indicates, there have been problems. There have been what I will call glitches. And many of those have more or less recently, and I'm speaking of, in the 21st century, come into significant public view. And that's why I asked whether or not it was in fact a new kind of relationship between the U.S. and Egypt in the Bush administration, or whether, as I've laid my cards on the table, whether this was merely the fruition of things that were brewing all along that have allowed these glitches to come into public light. What were some of these problems that members of Congress, the public, Egyptian human rights advocates, and others have pointed to in the last 10 years or so? Certainly one of them has been Egypt's so-called cold peace with Israel. Certainly those who thought or hoped that the 1979 peace treaty would lead to a full-fledged, open borders, warm, so-called full peace between Egypt and Israel have been very much disappointed. While formally at peace, the two countries' relationship can hardly be described as warm, and indeed, in 1982-83, during Israel's invasion of Lebanon, Egypt withdrew its ambassador for about 8 months, and from 2000 all the way in 2005, after the violence of the Second Palestinian Intifada, Egypt recalled its ambassador, so the diplomatic ties were in fact all but completely frozen for the first 5 years of this century. Many, particularly in the United States, both supporters of a strong Israel and others, have criticized the Egyptian side for not moving forward more robustly on a full peace with Israel. Another problem has been the public American opposition to certain Egyptian diplomats on the international scene. Part of this ambivalence toward Egypt's regional relationship has been expressed in recent years in some fairly high-level opposition to the role played by certain Egyptian diplomats on the world scene. Perhaps one of the best examples of that occurred in 1996 during the Clinton administration, when the United States vetoed the possibility of a second term in office for the Egyptian diplomat Boutros Ghali, who had been the Secretary General of the United Nations, the only Secretary General not to have served more than just one term. The U.S. made it very clear they didn't want Boutros Ghali back, and indeed he wasn't. More recently, in 2005, the United States very publicly opposed, this time unsuccessfully, the reappointment of the Egyptian Mohammed al-Baradei as the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and in what some considered a very high-level international rebuke of the American policy. Baradei was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, in fact, several months later. And lastly, the United States has long had a testy relationship with Amr Moussa, former Foreign Secretary of Egypt, and now the Secretary General of the Arab League since 2001. So this high-level tension with some very prominent Egyptians on the public stage has been another example of this so-called flawed relationship. Certainly, both in Congress and elsewhere, there has been criticism, actually for many years, but some high-level criticism in recent years about the situation involving human rights in Egypt. Two of the more prominent cases were that of the Egyptian politician Ayman Noor, head of the Ghad party, the Tomorrow Party, who was imprisoned after the 2005 presidential elections and actually just released suddenly yesterday, as a matter of fact. I engineered that for this talk, by the way. And the arrest and imprisonment and the he's in the United States, so they can't arrest him, but an Egyptian who holds American citizenship, a very prominent political scientist, Saad-Eddin Ibrahim, arguably one of the most prominent academics in civil society in Egypt and a human rights advocate. those two in particular, Ibrahim because of his American citizenship and Nur because of he was the runner-up in the presidential election in 2005, drew a lot of public attention in the United States. In fact, even President Bush mentioned Ayman Nur by name in a speech in 2007, and the Egyptians bristled, in fact, at this. And indeed, there's already a lot of talk going around now that the sudden release of Ayman Nur early is a symbol to the new Obama administration, that a page has been turned. Now, it'll be interesting to see if Obama administration now wants to lay off Egypt on the human rights issue or not. Another issue that has become particularly prominent, and I'm sure you've read something about it, have been the calls for reduction in American aid to Egypt that have been made, especially within Congress, but also among certain human rights organizations, including Sa'd-ad-Din Ibrahim. After September 11th, back in 2001, the Bush administration, in fact, conducted an in-depth review of America's assistance program to Egypt. This has been prompted by a number of things. Certainly the fact that Muhammad Atta was one of the lead hijackers in the 9/11 plot, but also, frankly, neoliberal concerns about economic reform, free trade, the stifling effects of the Egyptian bureaucracy on economic change were also reasons that prompted this review. In 2004, however, after considerable American pressure and the toppling of Saddam Hussein, President Mubarak, in fact, appointed a so-called reformist cabinet under Prime Minister Ahmed Nazif. The new cabinet's economic team and the American government negotiated a heavily conditioned memorandum of understanding for reforming, quote-unquote, Egypt's financial sector. Still, aid continued at nearly $2 billion a year, but it has gone down recently. In 2008, it was down to $1.7 billion in aid to Egypt, and President Bush, before leaving office, proposed a 12% reduction in that for 2009. Another pressure point in reduction of aid has been calls within Congress to withhold particularly military aid until Egypt did more, in Congress's opinion, did more to stop the smuggling of weapons into Gaza from the Egyptian-controlled Sinai, and until Egypt implemented reforms within its judiciary and curbed torture by state agencies. This was one of the things that President Mubarak was particularly enraged by, because U.S. aid prior to this had never been provided with such conditions. Now, we should point out that in March 2008, last year, to keep Egypt's cooperation in cooling tensions between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice actually issued a waiver overriding this congressional bill so that the aid, in fact, continued to flow despite those conditions. Another issue or problem, glitch, if you will, in the relationship between the United States and Egypt, this time coming from the Egyptian side, has been what Egypt perceives as the United States' double standard toward nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. In recent years, certainly starting in the mid-2000s, Egypt has issued very public calls for a so-called nuclear-free zone in the Middle East, and has pointed to Israel's all but acknowledged possession of nuclear weapons and Israel's failure to ratify the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as destabilizing, as a destabilizing factor, and a factor encouraging Iran's own potential production of nuclear weapons, something that neither Egypt nor the United States wants to see. The American attitude has been sorely lacking in the Egyptian perspective. Indeed, to this hour, the United States has not even publicly admitted that Israel has nuclear weapons, as the Veteran Washington correspondent Helen Thomas recently pointedly asked President Obama if he knew of any countries in the Middle East who had nuclear weapons, and he very deftly moved to another topic. So from the Egyptian perspective, it is not only a double standard to say we want to stop nuclear proliferation in countries like Iraq, Iran, Syria, further east in places like North Korea, but allow it in the case of Israel. They say it's not only a double standard, but it actually is an encouragement to Iran, and it is not in our, that is Egypt, or the United States' interest to see that happen.